Professor Ciaran O'Neill, expert on 19th century Irish history. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So maybe start by talking to us about heroism in Irish history, because this course deals with a lot of the great icons of modern Ireland, from Wolfe Tone and Robert Emmet, all the way up to Patrick Pearse and Michael Collins. What's your take on, I suppose, the heroism in Irish history?
Well, heroism is probably one of the key dominant themes of 19th century Irish history. When we teach it, we constantly end up talking about either great patriots who made their name by a process of sort of violent confrontation, or a great dramatic stand. And we're thinking here of people like Robert Emmet, maybe the classic example of that. The other tradition is of charismatic pacifists, usually politicians, and we think of people like O'Connell, who make their name almost on the back of a threat of violence, implied violence, huge crowds behind them that they can use for leverage, and that they present themselves as the front man for a sort of a baying mob. So always there's this violence at the back of these charismatic pacifists. But in the heroic tradition, more interestingly maybe with a character like Robert Emmet, you find almost the opposite. You find somebody who has no crowd behind them, sometimes quite literally like Robert Emmet, no crowd behind them, as they make their dramatic revolutionary stand. And they're a compelling, dramatic kind of force in Irish history, and yet in terms of their historical actual value, if you know what I mean, almost entirely useless or irrelevant at the moment of their greatest triumph.
Now, we have debated Robert Emmet at various student events here at Trinity.
Yeah.
And we are on opposite sides, though, in these debates, because you kind of see Robert Emmet as a bit of a loser.
Yeah, I mean, he did lose. He was both executed and had an unsuccessful rebellion.
Lots of people lose, but they're not always losers. I think you maybe have are as fond of him as
I do have.
others.
I do have strong feelings about him. I think his rebellion was inept. I mean, demonstrably inept. There was only, our best estimate is about 80 people involved in it. And the culmination of it, and the reason he's remembered at all, is because of this really eloquent speech at the dock, which is fine because we have records of it. And that's why it's remembered and it's been recited, and it's a key cornerstone of the nationalist tradition. But in terms of the actual event itself, all I can see as a historian analysing the event itself is a man in a dandified uniform walking up towards Dublin Castle and then running away from Dublin Castle to the Wicklow Mountains before he even gets to the point of his desire, with nobody behind him. I mean, for me, it's the ultimate farce, and it's the ultimate subversion of the heroic tradition.
Okay, well, moving on then to, say, the famine. The famine is the great watershed moment in modern Irish history, and it slices the 19th century in half, and it pretty much changes everything afterwards. Yeah,
I mean, I think we even teach it that way. And if you look at the historiography of Ireland, if you look at our key textbooks over the years, they often break either side of the famine. So we have Ireland since the famine, Ireland pre-famine is often even in the textbooks that we use to teach Irish history. And it is a watershed moment. We almost half our population. We have 1 million dead afterwards, and it dictates the very pattern of Irish emigration to the present day, not least in the 19th century and the 20th. But right now, our migration and emigration patterns are still absolutely the result of the famine and what it did to Irish society.
And during the famine then we have the Young Ireland Rebellion of 1848, and we have that whole Young Ireland romantic nationalist movement in the 1840s. Now, you've been harsh on Emmet, whereas I would see Emmet as an inspirational figure, even though the events of the 23rd of July 1803 failed. But Young Ireland, they seem completely impractical.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the usual criticism of Young Ireland, and I think again we're on the opposite side of this debate as well, Patrick. The usual criticism of Young Ireland is that they're ineffectual, they have no particular rebellion, they have no giant insurrection, and they're just a bunch of would-be kind of media stars who are compulsive autobiographers. They're constantly writing about themselves and their own achievements. And some of them go so far away from their original Irish patriotic ideal and idealism that they end up being colonial administrators out in the empire itself. I mean, Charles Gavan Duffy is the classic example of somebody who went from being an Irish separatist patriot, a young romantic nationalist, to somebody who was actively engaged in governing for the British out in the colonies. And there are others who have this pattern as well. Why I would defend such a group of people, I suppose I would say, first of all, their contribution to symbolic sort of cultural nationalism in Ireland is hard to estimate. It's so strong. People like Davis, people like Duffy. I mean, the ballads, the poems, the journalism of that period, to a huge extent, dictates what happens in the cultural revival movement afterwards. And a great deal of the nationalist imagery that we take for granted today, from the symbols of Ireland, the harps, the flags, to the slogans of Ireland, past and present. A lot of these come from the Young Irelanders, along with a sort of a huge impact on Irish political thought and civic republicanism.
And you mentioned even there the flags, even the tricolour, the green, white and orange dates
Sure.
from that. And, but does that mean that they're important for what they achieved in symbolic terms rather than...
Well, if as you say, it's unfair to juxtapose them with someone like Robert Emmet, I would say that their rhetoric was almost as grandiose, and yet their long-term effect on national tradition is somehow more measurable and more varied than Emmet, who just left a great speech and a good story.
But I'm still not really getting what the Young Irelanders left. Is it that they made people think differently about the Irish nation? Because other people like O'Connell were talking about the nation, Grattan and even Tone. So what was different in the way that they presented it?
The Young Irelanders don't come from the fully gentrified background that a great deal of our patriot tradition did, our traditional patriots, if you know what I mean, the kind of Wolfe Tones and all the rest of it. They came from a slightly lower social cachet. There was a mix of Protestant and Catholic within them. And they delivered a platform of kind of education and societal reform in their writings that was absent from previous glorying kind of patriots like Emmet. They were pro increased and democratic access to education. They were pro educating as insofar as it was possible the working man, the working class, the working woman, and set up reading rooms to do that. So I think with Young Ireland you can see a sort of a genuine attempt to change society. With Robert Emmet, I never see anything like that. I see a genuine attempt to hijack society and then run it in the way it has been run before. So I think that's what's laudable about the Young Irelanders. I think they wanted a new Ireland.
What about the Fenians then? Because they're the sixth rebellion mentioned in the 1916 proclamation. But, you know, they didn't really achieve much in Ireland. But yet, I suppose if you look at them in the international context, there was a lot more to them then in that light.
Yeah, and I think going back to what we said about the post-famine immigration, the Fenians are a great example of the many paths that immigration took Ireland on. To a huge extent, separatist and physical force, violence and nationalism. It becomes a story of the diaspora rather than a story within Ireland. Ireland is almost a docile society for large stretches of time in the 19th century, quite against its reputation, I think, internationally. A lot of the sort of vigour in the physical force nationalist movement is coming from the Irish migrants based in America, based in Britain, who have a grievance, who have a reason to want to act upon the current situation of Ireland that they feel forces them out. So to a certain extent, violence becomes a kind of a transatlantic phenomenon, and the Fenians are a great example of that, right from the fact of the fabulous story of the Fenian raids between 1866 and 1871, where you have upwards of 500 to 1,000 Fenians crossing the border to Canada from the northeastern cities and attempting to invade parts of Canada as a sort of a blow or a riposte to British government in Ireland. I mean, the sheer absurdity of attacking Canada to free Ireland is somehow, there's a truth within that, I think.
But it was, you could say, okay, it sounds ridiculous now, Ireland's invading Canada, but it kind of maybe catches the British unaware that if it had been successful, you could have said it might have inspired a rebellion in Ireland. So
well,
maybe
it certainly caught the poor Canadians unaware. I mean, they weren't expecting to have 1,000 angry Irishmen attack at the Battle of Ridgeway or Fort Erie. So it certainly, I think it was a surprise to everybody involved, including maybe some of the Fenians themselves. I'm not sure it really scared Britain. I'm not sure it was really a clever way of doing that, but it certainly it's made a great story.
And maybe they were also counting on all of the Irish who had fought on both sides in the American Civil War being able to provide a military expertise, but that never really seemed to materialise.
No, and yet new research kind of puts the figure of the Irish involved in the American Civil War at upwards of 170 to 200,000 people, which is as significant, indeed comparable only to the Irish involvement in the First World War. I don't think it's generally recognised that the Irish kind of contribution to the American Civil War was that big. So that's something that more work needs to be done on, first and foremost. And second of all, I think that's a very acute observation. I think the Fenian invasion of Canada also has longer-term repercussions and impacts on the Confederacy, sort of the Canadian identity. And likewise, the Irish contribution to the American Civil War actually has a bigger impact, obviously, in America than it does, as it was projected it might, in Ireland afterwards. And there was this idea that this 170,000 Irish might come home and fight, but of course, it's a very difficult thing to transport that many people back to do that.
There was a darker side to the Fenians, though, as well, with their bombing campaigns in Britain. And I find it somewhat uncomfortable reading back on those events, because with the spectre of modern day terrorism, the idea of planting bombs, and they planted one in the House of Commons and planting them at train stations, that it's a new form of attack, and it really is an early form of terrorism.
Yeah, it is an early form of terrorism, and I don't use that word lightly. I don't think it should be used lightly. I think growing up as a child in the early kind of 1980s in Ireland, you had all these references: bombs in train station, bomb scares in airports, bombs going off in large public buildings. This is what's magic about history to a certain extent, is and also slightly depressing, is that when you look back and you see these early indicators of the same tactic, the same technique. You find a bomb being planted in the House of Commons during this dynamite campaign that was active and funded from America in the 1880s until about 1885, when it stopped. And this was a sort of a new form of terrorism, a new form of Irish nationalism, and a way of hitting the British. But it was really, I think if you look at it in the round, really an indication of how desperate the Irish nationalist movement in America had become, in that every attempt at major insurrection, at major rebellion, at sending over an invading force had failed so badly that really they were reduced to sending pot shots and a sort of mail-based bombs, basically, into mainland Britain as their only means of really rebelling.
And it comes back to that age-old problem about definition, that when someone's own side is doing something, they tend to justify it and see this as fighting for freedom, whereas when the other side do it, your opponents, then that's terrorism. And people are slow to call something their own side is doing terrorism.
Yeah, and you see those parallels today, same as you do in the 1880s. And the reaction to the dynamite campaign in Britain is, of course, one of abject horror. And how could people behave in this way? It's the most cowardly form of attack. And I mean, the rhetoric of that era is very much what we heard again in the last decade or 15 years in the War on Terror. And really, I mean, I don't think it's spurious to draw those parallels. The rhetoric is exactly the same from authorities and governments as it was in the 1880s. And likewise, the rebels will justify it on counts of, well, this is the only way left to us, and it's also a democratized form of power and violence.
Was the 19th century a violent place, well, a violent time? Was Ireland a particularly dangerous place in that period? This course is called Ireland in Rebellion.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure if it wasn't always in rebellion for the period 1798 to 1916, although there were various attempts to overthrow different aspects of British rule. Was this a dangerous, violent time?
Yeah, I think the reputation of Ireland and how we classically teach and learn about Ireland in this period is to think of it as a rebellious, violent place. And there's certainly a difference between how violent it is pre-famine and post-famine. I think at all times in the 19th century, the murder rate is surprisingly low. It's usually in the 200s pre-famine, it's usually about 100, between 150 in the post-famine era, and it's pretty constant. So we can say that in terms of murder rates and sectarian murders, it's actually quite low, and lower than a lot of European societies, which conflicts with the usual way we think about it. But then we have a lot of very strange crimes that are, apparently peculiar to Ireland. Cattle maiming is one of them. We have a higher than average amount of assaults on the person and on property, burglaries, house burnings. We love house burnings in the 19th century in Ireland. These are all very different, and they mark out Ireland as a society which has a high level of group and periodic communal violence, but a low level of personal or political violence throughout the 19th century. And these are things, again, that really conflict with our stereotypes of Ireland in the period. To answer your question, which I realise I haven't, Ireland isn't an atypically violent society in the 19th century.
Would you characterise it as a country in rebellion for much of this period?
No, I mean, the picture is very much one of a country that is emphatically not in rebellion for much of the 19th century. I don't know what that will do to your course title, but no, it's a country that's poor, that's under all sorts of stresses, and there's at all times a level of hostility, and at other times an apparent desire by huge parts of the population to change the society and change how it's governed. But there is never at any point, I think, the type of large-scale violence that you see in 1798 or indeed subsequently in the early 20th century. It just isn't there, and we can't pretend it is.
Okay, Professor Ciaran O'Neill, thanks for coming in and challenging, shaking up some of the central ideas in this course. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick.